waiting on a transplant list for a double lung transplant for 5 years. So I was kind of getting weary and knew that, hopefully that it would come, but I knew I would die without it. So the night before my NDE, I was working on some folk art in my cabin in the backyard. And I just heard the Lord's voice say, Mike, put that up, put all those art supplies up. I thought, wait, I've never heard him speak to me, just like in everyday terms of something I was doing. And I said, okay. It's like, talking to a friend. I'm like, okay. I said, all right. So I started packing it all in boxes. And as I was walking across the yard to go to the back porch, my wife says, hey, come in here quick. You got the call. And you don't know what that meant to me when I heard her saying, this is the hospital on the phone. You got to get in here and talk to them. And so I was like, okay, yeah. So, I had, when I first got listed, I got a call for transplant 6 months after I got listed in the first year. And it turned out to be what they call a dry run. They couldn't use the donor's lungs because they found a mass on it. And so it was very discouraging because they had, got prepped me and everything and sent me home.
Oh.
So then I waited another 4.5 years. And then so this next call, I was like praying, hoping that this was it. So when I got on the phone with the lung surgeon, I said, how do you know these are good, viable lungs? I mean, are you sure? And he goes, oh, no, yeah, these are good and you need these. So I said, okay. So we went on to the hospital. And so I got there and they started prepping me, shaving my chest and hooking me up to all these, IVs and just really intricate things. It was like, I knew it was necessary, but it was like a little overwhelming at first because they were putting a port in my neck, and that was for all the things that they're going to need to do, and you had to be completely still and sterile. And they put this like tinfoil blanket over me. That's what it looked like. Or anyway, and just my neck was sticking out. I couldn't see this, but I was told this later. And so that's where they put the port in, and they had to make sure it's by the jugular vein. So they had to make sure everything was precise. I couldn't move. And, of course, everything was numbed up, so I didn't feel anything. But they got it in, and I started thinking to myself, this is real. This is really happening. And, facing an organ transplant, especially double lung, it's like huge. It's huge. It's like, oh my goodness, they're going to I always said they're going to rip out my old lungs and they're going to, install some new ones, it's like crazy things they can do now. So, but I was in total peace. I trusted that the Lord had it in his hands, and I had a lot of people praying for me. So I said, it's going to be okay, Mike. So I'm laying there and said my goodbyes to my wife and said, see you on the other side. And so they wheel me in, and I guess they must have injected me with the IV to put me to sleep. And so it was happened pretty quick. Once they put that in the IV, you're kind of out. And so they're doing the surgery, and it's a 12-hour surgery. It's pretty intricate. It's pretty intense. And so they told my wife, we will contact you and give you updates. Well, she went home because it was going to be a long haul and she needed to go rest. And so they said, just go home, we'll call you. So she's lying in bed, and I had oxygen tanks on my front porch. That was my deal. I had like 20 tanks. They're pretty large oxygen tanks, about 3 feet tall. And so I always had them out there, and especially for the oxygen tank company to go ahead and pick up the old tanks. So anyway, all of a sudden in the middle of the night, one of the tanks falls over, boing, and my wife wakes up And she said, Mike, oh, Mike's getting a transplant. So she calls the hospital and she says, what's going on? I need to know what's going on with my husband. And they said, well, first lung in. So the first lung was in. And of course, I had machines that were breathing for me. And so oxygenating my blood. And so anyway, she's like, okay, she kept praying, fall back asleep again. And so then another 6 hours, and as the surgery continued, and they got the second lung in, and they, it's a big procedure. Not to be too graphic, but they cut the breastbone and the rib cages opened up so they can get to the lungs. So anyway, so I realized this after. Thank God I didn't look into it too much before, but I realized the intensity of the surgery. But so they got both lungs in, and my other lung surgeon sutured me. Well, yeah, I guess they were about to suture me up, but they anyway. Long story short, the lung surgeon, there was one clamp left on an artery, I guess, and I don't know. I don't want to blame him. Maybe he was tired. I'm sure he was. But they tag team between two lung surgeons because one can't do that whole 12-hour shift. So anyway, the lung surgeon took off the clamp too early, and I bled out. So all the blood in my entire body just left. And how I know that is that my wife the next day had asked the nurse, what happened? What do you mean he bled out? And the nurse goes, he died. They were fast and furious doing intravenous blood transfusions, to get him to life. It was so frantic, and I guess it's so intense that when the surgery was over, I had a gash on the top of my head. My wife calls it the Amazon smile on the back of my head, and also something on my foot. So I venture to say it was pretty rough for the doctors and nurses to get me back to life. So, but anyway, when the doctor took off the clamp and I bled out, I died, and I started raising off the table. I saw myself. I saw them working on me, and I thought this shouldn't be happening. And I was going off the table, and I'm like, I think I died. And as I'm going off the table, right immediately when I was leaving my body, I heard these voices. You're not good enough. Who do you think you are? And just like, saying all these kind of things to me. And as a Christian, I said, wait a second, you can't talk to me like that. In the name of Jesus, you be quiet. I said, stop. And those voices silenced and never spoke again. And when I raised up a little further through the ceiling into the heavenly realm, I saw all around me these swirling lights. And as I was looking at it, there were wings, and I noticed there were angels all like encircling me. And I was looking in amazement. I'm like looking at these beautiful colors, and I'm going, wow, I mean, like, this is so beautiful. And then they start singing, and they said, Mike's coming home. Mike's coming home. When a believer dies, the angels rejoice that we're coming to the heavenly kingdom. And I'm like, I was overwhelmed, like, who am I that they should be even saying that? And, when they started singing that, I heard a voice. It was the Lord's voice, and he said, no, he's just here for a visit. So at that point, I was standing in heaven, and it was bright, hot light. It was just so intense. And as far as I can see, as far as the eye can see, all around me, it was just light. It was beautiful. It was like, it was just total. I tell people, like, it was total bliss. It was total, like, unbelievable that I was standing there in glory. And I'm like, I just stood there for a second. I was collecting my thoughts. I didn't see anybody. I didn't hear anything. I was just in this. I,
What did you see at that
well,
point, at that moment?
I just saw, it was like light everywhere, and like underneath me, above me, behind me, in front of me. It was just bright light. I was engulfed in this light.
Could
I
you
call it,
see you?
yes, I saw myself standing there,
You saw your
and
body? Like,
I saw my body, but it almost looked like I was in white myself. I call it bathed in light, bathed in heaven's light. And that's what I felt. And then in my mind, because you still have your faculties, in my mind, I thought, I was starting to think of my whole life, kind of flashed before me. And I was and there was nothing there that made me feel guilty. It was like everything was washed away, all the mistakes, all the failures, all my sins. And then this realization came over me. It's Jesus. It's him. That's why everything's washed away. I mean, it's all him. He filled the heavens. He was all in all. I felt every particle of my being it was Jesus covering me. His blood washed away all my sins. And I just felt like so free. And it was like no worries. And then I thought, wow, we used to worry about so much on the earth. We worry about our finances. We worry about our health. And while we're going through suffering and everything, it's not pleasant, but it's such a short time. It doesn't feel like it, but in the light of eternity, it's a blip. It's not even
and you had all
worth
those thoughts at that
all those
moment.
thoughts
Did
in
you
that
see
moment.
any little flashes of anything, even a split second of
Just
anything?
no, no, because at that point, after that happened, this peace came over me, like, wow, you know, Jesus is everything. He fills all in all. It was like an epiphany of, I knew these truths. I'm a preacher. I preach these things, but I felt them in heaven. It was the reality of what I taught on the earth was complete. I felt, because of Jesus, I felt validated. I felt complete. I felt whole when I was in heaven. It was like everything came to, just like the realization that this is where I belong. This is home. So it was so
Did you ever think, is this all there is? This right here?
well. What I thought, and I tell this jokingly to some other people, is like, I'm a Norwegian by ancestry, so I'm a Viking. I love exploring, right? So not pillaging and harming anything, but I just love the adventure. I think I don't know. I think that's just my nature, and that's how I am. So while I was standing there, I'm thinking, what else is here? My mind was going like, oh my goodness, the possibilities are endless, and yet in the midst of all that thinking and thought and feeling, I looked behind me. For some reason, I felt like something was coming behind me. So I looked over my left shoulder, and there was Jesus, and there was the donor. And here's why, right before that happened, when I stopped myself, before I noticed them behind me, I somehow in my spirit rose up. I said, I didn't want to see my mom or dad. I didn't want to see, I just wanted to see the donor. This guy died, or girl, to give me life, to let me live again. And I've had a heart full of gratefulness. And so I said, I want to thank my donor. As I shouted out in heaven. And all of a sudden I looked behind my shoulder, and there was Jesus and the donor.
What did Jesus look like?
You know what? Everyone asked me that and what the donor looked like. And they were fuzzy. And I was like, I always wondered why I didn't see them full face to face, the donor or Jesus, and especially Jesus. And someone said, well, if you would have seen Jesus, you wouldn't have come back. Somehow, something about when you see the fullness of God, that's it. You're going to stay.
I saw outlines.
Yes, outlines. But I knew in my spirit, my soul,
right,
that's who it was.
Right.
And because of what happened next, this is why I knew. So I see Jesus and the donor coming toward me in bodily form, and so I kind of trying to look at the donor to see what they were like, male, female, like what, and I did see that they were, um, you know, the skin tone looked like a Middle Eastern person, like a, you know, I don't know. That's just how I envisioned it for some reason, and I thought, oh, I wonder what their name is, but you know what? At that split second, it didn't matter. All I wanted to hug them, and I just felt like they felt grateful that I got them, that I got the lungs. That's the feeling I got when I was standing there. And then Jesus put his hand on my left shoulder and said, Mike, these are your new lungs. You receive them. Oh, I said, yes, Lord, I'll receive these lungs. I'll receive life. At that point, I was thinking I could have had a choice to stay or to leave, but I looked, kind of was looking down and going, I need to go back to the earth for my wife, my son, and I think I still have more work to do. And I had retired as a minister, but I didn't know what that work was going to be, what it was going to look like. So I said, after he said, these are your new lungs, I said, yes. And then I think the acknowledgement of the gift, the acknowledgement that he knew what I went through and all the suffering I went through. And he knew I needed these lungs. And I said, I agreed with the Lord and said, yes, yeah, I'll take them. I'll take them. And meanwhile, my body was struggling on the earth in the OR, they're trying to bring me back to life. And I think I had to make that agreement with the Lord that I would receive those lungs. And, I'm kind of thinking maybe that I was fighting on the OR table, because I don't know. I try to explain to people organ donation is a wonderful thing. I'm very grateful. But there's always thoughts before you get transplanted, whether it's a kidney or lung or heart, is that you're receiving into your body another person's organs, their DNA. It's a huge thing to contemplate that this person's organs are going into your body. And so it didn't freak me out. I heard some weird stories, but I just thought I needed peace in making that decision. And when the Lord said, these are your lungs, Mike, that totally transformed my thinking, totally gave me such peace that when I went back down, I knew that they were mine. They were a gift and they were mine. So I got back and they got the bleeding, I guess they got the artery and everything fixed, and the blood, 5 units of blood, I think it was.
So that was the entirety of your
That was
death
the
experience.
entirety of my trip.
It's huge, though.
Yeah, and so anyway, so I came back. They sutured me up. I think it was 68 staples across my chest, and then I was in a coma because I couldn't breathe on my own because of all the trauma. Because what happened was when I bled out, it scarred all my bronchial tubes. So, and anyway,
Of your new lungs.
Of my new lungs. So there I was in a coma. The machines were breathing for me for 10 days. And I could not tell this experience to anyone because I had a tube down my throat. And when I came to out of the coma, I only had a dry erase board that I could communicate with. Well, nobody could read my hieroglyphics because I just couldn't write. I was so weak. So the only thing my wife could actually get out of what I scribbled was take the tube out. Because, normally when you get intubated like that, maybe, the day after you get the tube taken out, the breathing tube and everything, right? Well, mine was I think it was 3 days after that, it took to get that tube out. So meanwhile, while I'm in ICU, my wife told me later when she was home and I'm in the coma, she was with her sister because we had a mold problem in our bathroom and they had to gut our bathroom and redo it. And she's sitting there with her sister Kay, and she says, "Oh my goodness!" And Kay's like, "What's going on?" She goes, "I just had this thing come over me." My wife Patty said, she said, "Mike died, went to heaven, and got to thank his donor." She goes, "I don't even know how I know that. It was like a knowing just came over me." So we'll see, I guess, when they take the tube out, I can finally talk to him if that happened or not. So, she waited. And so during that time, we had a friend who called my wife, Jonathan, and went to a church we used to attend, and he called Patty, and he says, "You're not going to believe this." I could hardly believe it, but something happened to me the other day, and I wanted to share it with you. And she says, "Sure, what's going on?" He goes, "Well, I was in my bedroom. I had already gone to bed, and all of a sudden, I bolted out of bed out of a dead sleep because the audible voice of God was in my room saying, 'Mike's with me.'" And he was upset because so many people were praying. "What do you mean Mike's with you?" It was the exact time that had died on the transplant table. So then he says, and that's not the only thing that happened. He said, days later, I get woken up again, audible voice of God in my room saying, "Mike's back. He's okay." So my wife's like, "Wow, God, you definitely know us and intimately, and you're a God of signs, wonders, and miracles, and you can do anything. And you just showed me by that knowing that Mike went to heaven, and then this man telling me that you he knew that had died, and then you had come back. God, that's incredible." So finally, um, my wife is going to go to the hospital to see me after the the intubating tube was coming out of my throat. And she told our friend Jeff, "Hey, you want to come with me? Because they're taking the tube out of my throat today, breathing tube." And so uh, he goes, "Yeah." And she goes, "Well, let me tell you what happened to me. I have this knowing that Mike went to heaven and met his donor." Well, Jeff's a doubting Thomas. He goes, "Yeah, really? Let me talk to him. Don't you say anything. I'm going to talk to him first." So Jeff goes bounding into the ICU room and with my wife. And no sooner they took the tube out. I mean, what a procedure. They take the tube out. You're gagging. You're breathing on your own for the first time. You know, uh, it's just an incredible experience. And my voice is like 3 octaves lower, like, "Hey, baby." Like as that announcer or that guy that does it. Anyway, so my voice is like 3 octaves lower. And Jeff said, "Hey, Mike, when you were out in the Netherlands, like out there, did you experience anything?" And I said, "Yes, went to heaven and I got to thank my donor." His eyes got like as wide as saucers, and my wife's crying, and she's like, "I told you, I told you, God told me that already." And so I said, "Yeah," and then I couldn't talk that much because my throat was still raw, but I was like, "Yeah, I went to heaven," and